Welcome! In this video, we will be continuing our unit on the Reformation by looking directly at the things that led Luther to begin the Protestant Reformation. We left off talking about church scandal and corruption, and the last one we didn't get to was the sale of indulgences. This requires a little bit of background information because this is an ancient and venerable church practice that goes back many centuries, but which most Protestants and non-Christians and even many Catholics or Orthodox today are not very familiar with. So let's go back. We talked about Dante and his Divine Comedy with the journey through Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, Hell, Purgatory, and Heaven. And this requires a little bit of some theology here. So in Christianity, and in particular in the Catholic Church, you have two ultimate destinies after death, heaven and hell. And purgatory is the idea, the root there being purged, the idea that if one is admitted to the beatific vision, to be with God in heaven after death, that you are perfectly holy and cleansed of all sin and attachment to sin and that sort of thing, and that this is not necessarily an instantaneous thing, that if someone dies a saint, they go straight to heaven, but that others are purged of that attachment to sin. And so this has variously been described as taking a length of time or being sort of painful, and this is described as purgatory, or this purging of the attachment to sin. Another example to sort of put this in a way that many of us moderns can understand it, I've heard this example used to explain purgatory. It's like if you throw a ball through someone's window. You might go up to their door, ring the bell, if you're being responsible about it, and apologize for having broken the window. And you might be really nervous, and the person would say, yes, I forgive you. And you turn to walk away, and the person would say, yep, I forgive you, but that window is going to cost like $100 to replace. I expect you to make good on the window. And so this is kind of another like weak analogy for purgatory, the idea that, again, in the Christian worldview, that God has forgiven a person's sins, but that there is still like a purging or a payment that is due. Anyway, this whole economy of salvation, if you will, of hell, purgatory, and heaven, also has one other aspect, which are called indulgences. And so these are things that people can do on earth in a way to begin paying back the window or to begin reducing one's attachment to sin. And so this can be by contributing, money out of free will. This can be true penitence, certain prayers, or things that one does to reduce your own attachment to sin to, in a way, like pay back the window for things that you've done wrong. That salvation in their eyes has come from Christ, they've received a life of grace, but there's still this sort of payment due. So this is, again, I often answer a lot of questions about this in class, and it's a little tricky and complicated, but hopefully this gets the main idea across. But what is not allowed, and what kind of began happening, is that those other pious practices, right, like just giving money out of charity or showing true sorrow and penitence for the things you've done wrong, kind of fell by the wayside. And what increasingly began to happen was the sale of these indulgences, like a piece of paper that says, okay, you're a good member of the church in a state of grace and you've received your sacraments. And also you gave money for this indulgence, which says it's not a get out of hell free card, which that's the big thing that people get confused about, but it's like a get out of purgatory free card. It's the idea that you've done something so good that you have remitted all of your punishment for your sins. And so that when you die, if you're, in a state of grace and you're all good to go, you're going to go straight to heaven because you've bought this piece of paper. And again, that's not exactly how the church would describe it, but in practice, that is what started happening. And so then people were very uncomfortable with that and were arguing that that's not what the church had always taught and that's an abuse of this practice, but this had been going on. Okay. Let's pick up with how this all affects Martin Luther. Martin Luther is a Catholic priest. He, in his early life, had this profound conversion experience where he was caught in a storm and did one of those things that sometimes people do, which is he thought he was in mortal danger and he said, "Oh God, if you get me through this terrible storm, I'll become a priest." Well, the storm ended, and unlike many of us, when you make such a vow in a moment of peril, he goes and becomes a priest. And he's living as a monk, but he shows promise and is sent off to become a professor. And he's a professor of theology. He's a Catholic priest who's teaching other young men how to be a good Catholic priest. He's also a very scrupulous guy, which means that he really struggled with this notion of God's forgiveness and kind of this idea of these indulgences in heaven and hell. And he had these like deep yearning fear that like God was trying to trick him or trap him, or, you know, he would secretly commit some sin and would be forever condemned for it. And he had a lot of these worries. And so he saw these indulgences from other people as really being bad because he thought they were giving people this really bad sense of security that they really shouldn't have. And he really kind of wrestled with this. There was this Dominican friar named John Tetzel who was selling a particularly bold indulgence that offered, you know, this broad degree of forgiveness from purgatory, and was raising money for a nearby archbishop. And Luther sort of called him out and told all the people in his town not to buy them because they weren't any good. He wasn't teaching against purgatory. He wasn't teaching about indulgences in general, just saying that buying them on a piece of paper was no good. That could have been the end of it, except John Tetzel went and tattled on him because his boss, the archbishop, was a powerful man who had taken out massive loans to bribe his way into the position of being an archbishop. And so he sent some authorities to complain about Luther, and it became a whole big row. Well, Luther, to defend himself, and remember, he's a university professor, like a seminary professor who's mainly teaching other young men how to be a priest, he is often leading these discussions on topics. Well, much as if you were here in my room, I might post things for discussion on a whiteboard. Well, what in Luther's day, the best we understand, is he would post things on the door for discussion. And so there is this dramatic image of him, you know, being this reformer and this anti-Catholic guy, like walking up to the church and nailing the 95 theses, complaining about abuses in the church, saying, "Take that, Catholic Church." But in reality, it was his own church, or at least his own classroom, and he was putting these 95 discussion topics of things that were problems in the church, which many other people knew about, many other people talked about, and it was kind of just an ordinary thing. I mean, they were seen by many as being pretty bold, and that would have again be the end of it until someone took them down. Was it someone who hated what Luther said to try to hide his theses? No, it was someone who thought that Luther had a great point, and they really respected these 95 discussion topics that were seemingly very critical of the church, particularly of this sale of indulgences, as demonstrated by Friar Tetzel. And they used nearby Gutenberg printing press to spread and reproduce these theses. So it was not Luther's plan to become this local celebrity, but in the 1500s, this effectively goes viral. And so nearby bishops and high-ranking prelates of the church are alarmed at this priest who's seemingly gone berserk and attacking this well-respected practice that the church had been doing for a long time. And so, again, the authorities in the church complain, and they send really people from Rome to basically put Luther kind of on trial and basically say, listen, if you just take that all back, you'll be like forgiven and go back to your normal life, and you need to basically stop writing books or pamphlets that are attacking established church practice. And so they send a cardinal, and a cardinal is a high-ranking bishop of the Catholic Church. They're in the elite group that elects the next pope at a papal conclave. And so this is the Cardinal Cajetan, who arrives at Augsburg to talk to Luther in order to get him to recant. And he does not. Similarly, a year later, Emperor Charles V presides over the Diet of Worms. People love to think that it's the Diet of Worms, but the Diet, or meeting at Worms, where again Luther is demanded to recant, take back everything he says. Very famously, Luther refuses to do that. Here's an image of 95 Theses. This is the edict at Worms, where church officials are demanding Luther recant. He says that he cannot, it is neither safe to go or reasonable to go against conscience, so he will not, so help me God, and he refuses to take it back. While they debate what to do with him and give him an edict of excommunication, he is secreted into hiding and is, many people presume him dead because he's declared an outlaw under the ban of the Holy Roman Empire, and in a way they think people are out to kill him. But in fact, a man named Prince Frederick the Wise actually shelters Luther and puts him up in the top of a tower for over a year. And so many people think that he's dead. In this time, there are many debates as to whether the church needed reform or not. And one of the interesting things that happen is, outside of the pyramid here, this had mostly been a debate between pope and bishops, king and lords, but the lower classes got wind of this and took Luther's ideas to mean that they could launch a massive rebellion. And so a grassroots movement that is like a leveling of all society, of tearing down the nobles and the church and church teaching, happens. And Prince Frederick actually, at this point, lets Luther out, and Luther says that God hates nothing more than a rebel, and this is not what he wanted, all this violence, and that the princes, the nobles, should crush the peasant rebellion as if the peasants were dogs. And so the peasants, a lot of them kind of thought they were doing what Luther wanted, but then they lose all their support of Luther, and he comes out on the side of the princes. And so as a result, they successfully crush the peasants and the peasant rebellion. And I believe over 100,000 German peasants die in this peasant rebellion. While Luther was in that sort of house arrest, he took he translated the New Testament into German and gave it as a gift to Prince Frederick the Wise, because most copies of anything in the Bible were in Latin up to that point. This launches into a series of German wars of religion, where the emperor and half of the 300 princes of the Holy Roman Empire side with the Catholic Church and the Pope. A league with the great name Schmalkaldic League are a group of 150 or so Protestant princes who ally with Luther, and war rages up and down through Germany, and it is a brutal, brutal war of religion where the idea being, people often have this mental block where they struggle to understand, how can people kill in the name of religion? It seems like this counterpoint, but the way of thinking, just to try to make some sense of this, is that what's worse than death? Well, hell. Hell's worse than death. Therefore, if you can kill some people to prevent other people from going to hell by believing in false heretical teachings, then you are justified in doing it. And both sides did this, and it devastated Germany. This all gets concluded at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where the emperor accepts the Lutheran confession of faith, and they accept a peace with the Latin phrase cuius regio eius religio, whose the region, his the religion, where each of these 300 princes can choose for his own land and his own peasants and people whether they will be a Lutheran or a Protestant. Emperor Charles, after signing this, is so disgusted after having been king for nearly 30 or almost 40 years, retires to a monastery to live with and among Catholic monks. He's kind of a defeated and broken man who was kind of a king of the world of many different parts of this large empire that he ruled. And it leaves us with, again, the Peace of Augsburg. And so neither the Catholics nor the Lutherans fully triumph, and you basically have a split Germany. We will pick up next time as we look at the tenets of Reformed or Lutheran theology. Thanks for watching.